This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Today, we will be talking about how a particular person, the scientist and inventor, Nicola Tesla, has been portrayed in both popular media such as films and books. In a few of the previous episodes, we spoke with Annie of the 5'2" blog about the movie and the book The Prestige, which shows Tesla as the archetypal mad scientist role. We also talked with the producer and lead actor of the movie The American Side. They used the idea of Tesla as the futurist who predicted and developed the ideas that could radically change the world as we know it. Today, we're going to focus in on who exactly Nikola Tesla was, his life and times, and how he was portrayed, how his portrayal in these films matches up to his real life. I am very happy to be joined by Chad Davies of the Scientific Odyssey Podcast to discuss all these fascinating films and this fascinating person of Nikola Tesla. Chad, you're a scientist. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast?
Sure, Steve. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate
it's my pleasure.
The opportunity to be here. My background actually is a little bit different than the subject that we're going to be talking about on the show. I have a PhD in computational astrophysics. I'm a professor of physics at a little access institution called Gordon State College. And then my podcast, as you mentioned, is the Scientific Odyssey, which is a show where we really look at the process of scientific inquiry. In other words, how science is done, how it asks questions and answers questions and that sort of thing through the history and philosophy of science. And so, my background coming from that is I'm really interested in not just what the results of science are, because I think oftentimes there's a lot of that goes on, but the process at which we arrived at those results and the people who did the work and what they did and the types of questions they asked and the things that they sort of thought were important, how they, stumbled around sometimes in the dark and sort of searched their way to the answers, how sometimes they got the right answers for the wrong reasons, or they got wrong answers but were on the right path. It's all just really fascinating to me.
That's excellent. I think that you are the exact person. When I was thinking about who to have on, I actually put it out there and I was like, who could this be? And then when somebody mentioned your name, I was like, why didn't I think of that in the first place?
Well, it's great to be here.
Excellent. Just to set things up, a little bit of context of some of the background that we'll be using here. Nikola Tesla has been used as a character or a literary device in a number of fictional movies and films. Today, a few of the pieces that we'll at least reference a little bit are The Prestige by Christopher Priest, which was also a movie, the movie The American Side, produced by Jenna Ricker and Greg Stewart, along with the novel The City of Light by Lauren Balfour. That gets a little bit into Tesla at Niagara Falls. I thought we'd start off with just two quotes from Tesla that I thought really got to the point of where we're going here. And then the one is, Tesla said, "One must be sane to think clearly, but one can think deeply and be quite insane." And the other one is, "The present is theirs. The future for which I really worked is mine." And I thought that those were just two really cool quotes that bookended what Tesla was all about. Now, Chad, can you just tell us a little bit about Tesla's early life?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tesla's kind of an interesting guy. One of the things that, probably your listeners should know is the biggest problem with Tesla is there's just so much information out there that's probably apocryphal or, folklore. I mean, some of it even, borders on almost fairy tale or mythology. It's until probably the last 15 years, 20 years, something like that, there wasn't a lot of good scholarship on his life. There wasn't a lot of folks looking in and really digging into the documents that sort of, laid out what his life was going to be like. And so there's all kinds of stuff that, especially if you go back before that, about 20 years or so, you'll find all sorts of information that's really, not entirely accurate, or at least not verifiable, if that makes sense. And that's one of the things that makes sort of understanding Tesla's life, especially his college years, from what I understand, that can be really, really tough, because what you end up having is you have this sort of this mythology that develops around the man that, especially I think gets influenced heavily by his later years, what we would think of sort of as the period after his most productive years scientifically. What we do know about him early years is he's sort of ethnically Serbian, but because of sort of the way things work in the Balkans, there's a lot of moving around. And so he ends up in what we would call, the fancy term is what's known as the Austrian Empire's Croatian military frontier. So, he's an ethnic Serb living in a part of Croatia at the time. And the biggest difference there, what's going on, is you have a religious difference. So Croatians tend to be Roman Catholics, Serbians tend to be Eastern Orthodox. And so Tesla's family, there are a number of his family members, or his ancestors, I should say, who are Eastern Orthodox priest. His father's an Eastern Orthodox priest. His grandfather on his mother's side is an Eastern Orthodox priest. And so he grows up in sort of this very religious environment. His mother herself is who Tesla credits his sort of ingenuity, his inventiveness, his eidetic memory as sort of springing from. His mother was, not formally educated in any way, shape, or form, but according to his accounts anyway, she was the person that sort of ran the farm or ran the family sort of stuff, if you want to call it that. His father was a priest. His job was to manage a congregation, to serve the Mass every Sunday. And so it fell to his mother to do a lot of the sort of figuring out how to get by in life, sort of creating and inventing all of the things around the house that you have to create and invent in a time before there are lots of modern conveniences. And so he really points to that. He grows up in that area. I think they spend a period of time in a little village called Smiljan, if I get the pronunciation there right, before they move to a little bit bigger city when his father gets reassigned to a larger congregation. He does some schooling there, and then somewhere in that period of time, his older brother is killed by being thrown from a horse, which really affects him profoundly. In fact, it affects the whole family really profoundly, and sort of colors his relationship with his parents after that. And then he comes down with cholera, I think is what most modern scholars think, is he comes down with cholera, and he's sick for about 9 months and almost dies multiple times during that period of time. And it's during then that, he wants to he's really fascinated with electricity. It's something he's seen in one of his schools, and electricity is kind of this newer sort of thing in the 1860s, and early 1870s when he's in that period. And so when that happens, he wants to go study electrical engineering. His dad wants him to become an Eastern Orthodox priest. He's really sick, and so dad sort of says, look, if my son will live, he can go be an engineer, and I'll pay for that. Just let him live, God. And he does, and so dad lives up to his promise and sends him off to the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz, which is a really good school. And I think that happens around 1875, if I remember my date correctly. And what we know about this, at least from the biographical, and this is where things are really tough, because there's going to be a period in here where he sort of just drops out. But in his first year, he's just an absolutely stellar student. In fact, from one of the things that I read, there are some accusations that he cheats in his math classes because he can do interval calculus in his head. I have read some accounts where, and again, these are probably apocryphal, but he can do very high-order differential equation calculations in his head. This is math that, here at our at Gordon State, we teach our students in their second year. Back then, those would have been taught probably in what you would think of as your junior or senior year classes, and he's taking them as a freshman. And he's able to write down solutions without, he can see the solutions immediately. So it gives you a sense of his vast intellect. And somewhere in his second year, he takes a physics class, and he kind of gets into a conflict with the professor of the physics class over what's known as the Gram, if I'm saying that right, the Gram dynamo. And the Gram dynamo is this really interesting thing. Again, it's this idea where you can sort of produce electrical current. But the thing is you have to have this part of the equipment called a commutator. And it's just, if you think of it, it's just a piece of equipment that helps the dynamo spin and makes contact so that the dynamo puts out the power that you want it to do. It's a very, very important part, but it's a part that wears out. And what Tesla sees is when he looks at this piece of equipment in his mind, he can imagine how to create this dynamo without that commutator. And so he's sort of in what you could sort of see, a young man kind of full of himself, maybe a little arrogant, sort of putting out, I can do that without the commutator. And his professor really takes him to task. And this seems to sort of, incite something in him, maybe a rebellious spirit, maybe sort of a frustration. But, the professor doesn't just call him out. He sort of humiliates him in front of the class. And after that, Tesla's investment in his college education really declines. He loses his scholarship after his second year. He takes up gambling, of all things, to sort of pay his bills. He loses all his money at one point, and then he wins it back after, his mom finds some money to get him into school. He uses that, gambles his tuition back, and actually, pays his family back. But by the end of his third year, he's pretty much done with school, and you're not really sure if he's got this bad reputation, and so nobody will give him the benefit of the doubt, and everyone thinks he's sort of on the con, or if he just feels like the school doesn't have anything to teach him, or if there's some combination of the two things. But you get a sense that, at least by his own claims, he worked really hard in school until he got frustrated by what was going on. By one account, he worked from he claimed he worked from 3 a.m. to 11 p.m. Probably there were naps in there, that sort of thing. But the guy obviously was a little bit of a workaholic. But the thing that's really interesting is that after he drops out, he sort of just drops out. He completely disappears. He ends up, I think, at one point in Slovenia, working for a company there doing some sort of an electrical or telegraphic bit of work. And he doesn't get a hold of his family. He's really ashamed that he's dropped out of college. And so what ends up happening is he sort of says, I'm not going to talk to my family, and I'm not going to tell them what's going on. And again, you can sort of see a young man in his late teens, early 20s, sort of really being ashamed of the fact that, his family sacrificed. They sent him to school. He has not achieved a degree. He drops out in his, what we would think of as his senior year. And so finally, what ends up sort of happening is that the authorities sort of realize that this guy doesn't have what they call a residence permit. And back then in Europe, if you wanted to live somewhere, you couldn't just move around. It's not like now here in the United States where, I live in Georgia and I decide I'm going to, move up to Tennessee or move over to Alabama or something. That's, I couldn't just do that then. If you wanted to move somewhere, you had to have the permission of the authorities and that sort of thing. And so he kind of gets arrested and taken back home. And during that period of time, when he is sent back home, at some point in there's a claim that he has a nervous breakdown, that he sort of, the stress of everything just gets to him. But eventually he ends up getting sent to Prague. And, he gets taken home. He sort of sorts things out at home. And a couple of his uncles sort of scrape together enough money to send him to Prague, where he's supposed to study at the Charles Ferdinand University. And there's a lot of question about whether he studied there or not. But it's pretty clear that at least he audited classes before finally getting some work at the Budapest Telephone Exchange. And that's where, in 1881, we do know that he ends up landing there, at least going there to take a job. The telegraph company isn't going yet. So what ends up happening is that he ends up at a different, what's called the Central Telegraph Office, which is supposedly the sort of central government telegraph office for a while before he moves over to the telephone exchange, where he's given the chief electrician position. So at this point, you can tell he's really actually pretty good at what he does, even though, and again, this wasn't super uncommon at the time, he doesn't have a formal degree to go with that.
What was, schooling was a little bit different back then, but did he have a specific degree path that he was going after? I think, in Graz.
I think it would have been something that we would have called maybe, I don't know if it would have been physics. You get the sense, in all the reading that I've done, there's no sense where he said he was studying physics. So you get the sense that maybe it was a polytechnic, it would have been engineering, or maybe applied physics or applied mathematics. I haven't seen a specific degree like we would see in the United States or in some places in Europe today.
It sort of is, biographies, especially in his schooling, is sort of reminiscent of Einstein. Even after he graduates and he's gone through like basically 4 years of study at this Polytechnic. Wouldn't that have put him head and shoulders above anybody else as far as understanding of science and physics and mathematics?
I mean, to some degree, absolutely. There's a sense where, again, and even in the United States, and when he comes over to the United States, this is absolutely the case. A lot of the sort of what we would think of as engineering would have been a craftsman trade as much as it would have been a university profession. So there is a sense, the fact that he has a significant amount of university education, he has, and specifically the big thing is his formal training in mathematics would have set him apart. Absolutely. There's no question about that. But even more than that, it's his mental acuity, his ability to, and as I've read about this, his ability to sort of fundamentally have an intuition about the physical systems he was modeling mathematically. He had this ability to be able to, in his head, see what parts should look like, and then just be able to immediately sketch them out and have those sketches. I mean, it's almost like, I think it's in the movie Amadeus, where you see Mozart, he's writing music, and there are no incorrect notes on his music, and you can play from his first drafts, which again, that's probably apocryphal. And there's a sense where Tesla does some things like that as well, where he sits down, especially later when he's doing a little bit of work in Pittsburgh with Westinghouse's engineering department, where he's able to sit down and in his head, he can imagine what the parts need to look like to make things happen. And he can sketch this stuff out, and he gets it pretty much right on most of the time. It's really quite fascinating.
Getting into his head a little bit, his father, mother, and maternal uncle that they know of all committed suicide. Is that correct?
I've not found any evidence to suggest that. I mean, the thing that's really interesting is I went out and looked both for his father and his mother, and both of them seem to have come down with just some sort of a longer illness. His father, like I say, he dies when Tesla's back home in between a couple of the university visits. I think it's 1783, 1784, or sorry, later than that. I'm sorry, 1778, 1789, somewhere in there.
1888.
Or yeah, 18. Sorry, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, oh, no problem.
Yeah. And so the thing that's interesting is you sort of get the sense that it's just an illness or a stroke or something like that rather than suicide. I've not read anything about the suicides, but this is that thing where it's, again, there's so much out there that's apocryphal, and you're not sure how much of this is true or not. So the stuff that I'm going on is just based on records, but that we're able to sort of cobble together. But it's not like those records are really great, especially from that part of the Balkans. So, it may be the case that by word of mouth or, one of those sort of oral traditions sort of grows up in the family. But I've not found a whole lot of evidence for that. And
it could be something that somebody else wanted to use, something where there was a little bit of obscurity to try and maybe put forward an agenda. Yeah.
I mean, that, there's, especially again, like you say, or like I've said before, I think there's that sense that, Tesla later in his life becomes very eccentric. And so there may be that sense that, this eccentricity may be a little bit of mental illness, obsessive compulsive or whatever that some people ascribe to his later years, that somehow is inherited from his family. We certainly know that during the period of when his mother is ill, and this is after he's come to the United States and achieved quite a bit of success and a little bit of fame, and he travels back to Europe for meetings at the Royal Society and in Paris, and he does travel home, when his mother is ill and is dying. He reports some really interesting sort of psychic phenomena, you would call, but I don't mean psychic in the paranormal sense, just sort of the kinds of things that you would attribute to somebody who is under a great deal of mental and emotional stress and strain. He has these sort of psychiatric experiences, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word to call it. And, those kinds of stories get amplified and told and connected to some stuff later, and then people will build pictures out of that.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. So we have a little bit of background on Tesla himself. One of the main things that Tesla worked on was electricity. Can we just do a quick overview of electricity? In the novel, the the Prestige, one of the main characters, Angier, he says, he stays in a hotel in Colorado Springs, and it's his first time where he sees electricity, and he's flipping on and off the light switch, and he says something that to him it seems magical right now, but tomorrow it's going to be the mundane. And I think that really is what electricity, it's magical and mundane. What is electricity? How does it work?
So, in the notes for the show, you kind of put this in there. And I think this is one of those places where it's really hard for us today to understand what was going on then. One of the things that's really interesting nowadays is we have a pretty good understanding of everything that's going on with electricity. We understand that in most cases, when you talk about electricity, if we're talking about electrons, these little particles moving through wires, those are being pushed around by electric fields that are generated by, something, whether it's a battery or a power supply or whatever. But at the time of Tesla, especially before 1897, when J.J. Thomson's going to first discover the electron, and that's going to postdate most of Tesla's early work in electricity. They actually don't really know what's going on, and that's one of the things that's absolutely fascinating about sort of when you get into looking at the history of electricity and the idea of what was sort of understood, is these guys who do the research, and all the way from some of the earliest figures, guys like Benjamin Franklin and Jason Priestley and some of those guys, through Oersted and Faraday and Maxwell, all the way up through Tesla, is they're sort of groping around trying to build models of what's going on without having a true fundamental picture of the true nature of matter. They don't have electrons. They don't understand what charge carriers are, all of that. And so their biggest idea is electricity really is a fluid. And, you can talk about it. I think one of the terms that I've read about during this period, maybe a little earlier, is an electrostatic effluvium, is sort of a fluid that flows through wires or whatnot as water flows through a pipe. And so the other thing that comes up is that, in the 1860s, a Scottish physicist by the name of James Clerk Maxwell had really come up with a theory of electromagnetism, how to relate, electricity and electric fields with magnetism and magnetic fields. And both of those had sort of been originally sort of really pioneered in terms of field theory by Michael Faraday about 30 years earlier. And Maxwell had produced this theory that nobody really understood, but that had worked really, really well. And so there were all sorts of, once he does the theory, and unfortunately for us, in a sense, Maxwell's going to die not all that long later of stomach cancer. But what's going to happen is a number of individuals from Helmholtz in Germany and his student Hertz to Tesla to, in England, a guy by the name of Heaviside, all of these guys are going to try to pick up and understand what's going on. Specifically in electricity is, there's sort of two kinds of things happening. One of the kinds of things that's happening is maybe something that starts at about the same time as what you have with Faraday, and that's Alessandro Volta is going to build the first what we call wet cell battery, which is then eventually going to lead to a dry cell battery. But Volta is going to develop this battery, whatever you want to call it, that's going to be able to generate an electromotive force, as it's often called then. We think of it now as a voltage, right? So, you get your standard, AA battery out of the drawer. It has a voltage of 1.5 volts. The best way to think of that is if you want to use another analogy for that, is to think of that voltage as a little like pressure in a pump system. And so the battery is going to produce some sort of a pressure that's going to drive the electricity through a circuit. And a circuit is sort of a complete path through which the electricity can flow. And so what you're going to get is just this pump, this battery, or, it might be something else that generates electricity. If that voltage is constant, we call that direct current. In other words, the voltage is constant. It produces a constant current through the circuit. and the circuit will behave appropriately with that. And that's, much of our modern electronics is what we would call DC electronics. Say the computer that you're using, or if you're listening to this podcast on, whatever your electronic device, a phone or an iPod, whatever the case may be, that's probably set up to run on direct current. However, there's another way to do that, and then that's to have the current alternate back and forth between a certain positive, or I shouldn't say the current, but the voltage alternate back and forth between a positive and negative. And so what you might think of as the pump flips directions in terms of how it applies pressure or voltage if we think about what the power source does. And so what happens is your current doesn't actually move very far, but it just moves back and forth fairly rapidly. And so at the time when Tesla is beginning to develop a variety of technologies, there's this real debate that goes on about whether, if you're going to use electricity, whether that's going to be direct current electricity or alternating current electricity, whether your current or your voltage is going to remain constant in your circuit, or if it's going to alternate back and forth. And the initial approach is really pretty much a direct current approach until a variety of alternating current technologies, which all date to, guys like Humphrey Davy and Michael Faraday, really begin to get developed in the period right before Tesla comes on the scene. Now, in terms of how common was electricity, it's certainly possible that engineers may never have seen electricity at the period of time, and at least in the movie, it's not entirely specific early in his career when he would have seen things. By the time he gets out to Colorado Springs, that would have been during Tesla's 1899, 1900, 1901, somewhere in their period of time. Electricity would have been more common then, especially in the big cities. But, Paris would have been the city of light. I don't know how electrified London would have been, but we certainly know there was some electricity in London. In New York City, by this point, certainly there are still a few DC power plants, but alternating current is beginning to become prominent. By 1899, Niagara Falls is pretty close to coming online. Certainly Westinghouse has gotten the contract for that. They've built the generators for transmitting power down into the St. Lawrence River Valley to Buffalo and places like that. And so, that's the sort of thing. Now, as I've read it, and this is, I think it's in one of the books on the current wars that I've read, one of the things that the author of the book really makes the important point of is what electricity did, especially if you're wealthy. And I mean, Angers in the Prestige is certainly presented later, especially after he gets out of his apprenticeship as a magician. He's represented as a fairly wealthy guy, or at least he dresses like a wealthy man. And, you get the sense that lighting it, then many of the houses of the wealthy were lit, but they were oftentimes lit by gaslight. In other words, you would run some sort of what we think of as natural gas or something like that into the house. You would light it on fire. And the big danger is that, of course, one of the byproducts of burning that natural gas was a buildup of carbon monoxide, which would kill people. And so there was always this incipient danger that in burning these gas lights, if you didn't have reasonable ventilation, which often would take place in the winter, you could actually kill everyone in the house pretty easily. So the idea is that, as Tesla's working with this stuff, and as the society is sort of getting used to this idea of having electricity, it's really something that's only going to appear oftentimes in rich people's homes. And then over time, as you get closer to that period in where Angers is in Colorado Springs, it's going to be one of those things that places like hotels will have. It is possible that Angers may never have seen that, though I think that's probably a little license from the author of the book. I would expect that Angers would have had the idea of readily available light in most of the large cities, especially in Europe, in London and Paris and places like that, at least through street lighting and that sort of thing. The interesting thing about electricity would have been that you didn't have to worry about it killing you. And that was probably, for many people, at least in terms of their homes and that sort of thing, that was the big change. But there was a sense that, and this comes back to, and I think it's Arthur C. Clarke sort of talks about, any technology that was significantly advanced according to a civilizational level would look like magic. And I think there's a sense a little bit where electricity might have looked a little bit like that. Whereas, when you first encounter this thing, you flip a switch, the light turns on, and there doesn't seem to be this need to light the lamps or any of those kinds of things. And that would have seemed a little magical, but then it would have just sort of dropped in a little later on. Now, one interesting thing, just, where I'm at, there's some history here in middle Georgia where, it wasn't until the 1930s that power was actually brought to the area. And it wasn't brought to the area until the Great Depression by the actions of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had actually lived here after he got polio. And that's one of the things that a lot of people here sort of talk about, is just that sense of, as electricity sort of shows up, it is at first very magical. And then people it becomes a part of their lives. And the thing that's really interesting is it begins to change some of the ideas of what we would call the rhythm of life. This idea, and there's an author I read who wrote this great book just on night. And he talks a lot about how human beings, in a sense, are a little bit like termites in the way we deal with light. When a termite builds a nest, that termite can only exist in a certain range of temperature and humidity. Otherwise, they dry out rather quickly and they die. And so what they do is they create as they create their nests and their tunnels and all of that sort of thing, they create the environmental conditions that allows them to be, what they are and do what they need to do. And in a sense, this guy draws the parallel that we as human beings oftentimes now do exactly the same thing with light. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting. I think if you think about driving in a car at night, in the middle of the night down a country road, the idea that you could do that without headlights is just, except unless it's a full moon. That's probably not something you're going to do it at more than about 5 or 10 miles an hour. And yet we just, commonly hurtle down these 2-lane country roads at 45, 55, sometimes 65 miles an hour without giving a second thought to it, because we can carry light with us. And I think that was the big change that, to me, as Angiers goes out to Colorado Springs, and especially in the movie where it's during the winter, out in Colorado Springs in the winter, had there not been some sort of lighting, he would have turned in at 5 p.m. and not gotten out of, the hotel until, 8. Instead, he's able to work well into the night. He can sit there at the bar or in the dining room and enjoy a meal and all of that. And that's the thing that I think electricity really makes possible, especially out on these frontier towns.
You brought up the current war and that there was these two different types of current. What was the current war, and who were the opposing sides in this war?
So from what I've been able to find, really in the United States, which is where a lot of the current war happens, because it doesn't seem to be as big a deal over in Europe. In the United States, the current war really seems to be happening between 3 major groups of individuals. First off, there's Edison and his sort of direct current model, which what he's doing is he's putting in power generating stations basically for individual homes, and then a little later on for small boroughs in New York, where he's creating electricity through direct current. He's transmitting it through wires. The farthest that he can push that electricity is about, I think, 1 mile or 2 miles. And so his generation stations have to be pretty close to the actual, populace that the generating stations serve. And so what ends up happening with that is that, there are some real issues in terms of he's running the current at a pretty high voltage, which is a little bit dangerous. And then there's noise and pollution issues. The second group is a guy by the name of Elihu Thomson. And Thomson's got some, what we would call early versions of an alternating current generator, but those early versions all use that commutator that we talked about, which is prone to wearing out. I can remember, and some of the listeners that you have may remember doing this as well, but I can remember as a kid, I took a class, I think in junior high, I think it was in 7th or 8th grade, and we took like a 9-volt lantern battery, and we used that 9-volt lantern battery to create an electric motor. And one of the things you had to have on that electric motor were some brushes to make electrical contact that would simulate the flipping of the direction of the voltage that you have to create alternating current. And so you could have a direct current source and create alternating current, which had some advantages, but those brushes would all wear out. And so that was the kind of technology that Thomson was using. And he was creating some kinds of things there. Now, Thomson and Edison had been involved in a long-running patent war over incandescent light bulbs. That was something that went back long before, Tesla ever got involved in any of this stuff. And then, over time, George Westinghouse and his company gets involved in sort of the power generating thing where they buy a bunch of patents from another sort of commutator-based AC current technology, which they begin installing in a variety of places. And it's a fairly successful and fairly profitable sort of a business. But again, you have the problem where you have to maintain these units, and the units tend to sort of break down and they wear out. And you got to sort of always be sort of fiddling with them. And so when Tesla shows up in the 1880s, he initially goes to work with Edison, and he's working on sort of helping Edison refine some things. And there's a point where he feels like Edison promises him a certain financial compensation for getting some of his generators working at higher efficiency, which he does. And then, Edison turns out that he doesn't sort of follow through on that, and whether he actually had made the promise or not is a matter of some debate. But it really frustrates Tesla, and so Tesla quits. At this point, this is a few years after he's done his university education. He already has his ideas for a commutatorless, in other words, an AC generating or an AC generator that doesn't require a commutator, and the equivalent motor that goes with it. And these are sometimes called polyphase AC generators, because he sort of figures out how to do this by using sort of electrical currents in three different what we call phases. And he can't find an investor. He's hoping that Edison will get really interested in all of this, and that Edison will be a big part of it. And Edison just couldn't care less. Edison hates AC. He doesn't want to be a part of it in any way, shape, or form. He thinks he's got the solution in DC power, and that all of this AC stuff is a scam. And so Tesla sort of gets involved in this, trying to find someone to buy or at least get interested in investing in the development of his AC technologies. Now, one of the things that's really interesting in the current wars is that once Westinghouse finally gets interested in these things, Westinghouse is eventually going to buy the patents. But during this whole period, Edison's realizing that he's not winning sort of the, and again, when we call it a patent war or the current wars, it's really a patent war. It's who controls the patents, who has the technologies. It's very similar to what you might have seen in the early 2000s or the mid 2000s, and some of the patent disputes between companies like Apple and Samsung, when the first mobile phones got developed, and then the tablet technologies, of who sort of developed those ideas and who had a right to use them and who had to pay money to who to use what and all of that. There were all of these patents on these technologies that were getting developed. And Edison and Westinghouse and Thomson kind of went at it, if we use a phrase I found it at other places I think is just great, just hammer and tongs. They really go after each other in the courts. But the thing that's really interesting is by the time that, Westinghouse buys Tesla's patents and makes Tesla, at least for a period of time, a very, very wealthy man in doing that Tesla, in his polyphase generator and the motors that go with it, has really solved the problem. I mean, his patents cover all the foundational and fundamental things that go on, and it turns out to be, the solution to the issue. And the thing that I always tell my students is what you think of now as the entire electrical infrastructure more or less is built on the work of Tesla, and more, or just as importantly, and this is the piece that gets left out, I think, a lot of times, and the engineering department at Westinghouse. Tesla comes up with the original ideas, and part of the thing is when I think it's about 40 patents that Westinghouse buys from him. But once those patents come in, they've got to sort of turn that into a working system. And so it's Westinghouse's engineering department working with Tesla that's able to do that over the period from about 1887, 1888 up through 1893, when Westinghouse gets the contract to light the Chicago World's Fair, which we call the Columbian Exhibition, because it's basically in the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering the New World. And in doing that, and I think the estimates that I've seen is something like $1 million is what Westinghouse basically pours into this. That's all kind of company loss, so that he can get that Niagara Falls contract. And he ends up getting the contract because he lights the World's Fair, and Tesla's technologies are so dramatically shown at one of the exhibition halls at the World's Fair. By that point in time, and then, there's a whole story about, Edison tries to show that alternating current is more dangerous by electrocuting animals in really horrifying, terrible ways. That, by the time of about 1893, by this point, I think it's J.P. Morgan has basically bought up a bunch of electrical companies, including Edison's company. They become what we now call General Electric, and this is the period of time where General Electric is formed. Edison is forced out because he just refuses to get on board with the fact that DC technologies are not the way to go. And by the time you sort of get to that period of 1893, 1894, 1895, the current worst thing is basically done, and Tesla's patents for what we call alternating current generation, those have formed the foundation of what is our modern electrical power grid.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Tesla, by that point, he really made his name, so to speak, and he made his fortune at Niagara Falls. Before we even go there, what was the technology that made Niagara Falls and that long-term power transmission possible? You were talking about that piece of technology that the other inventor in the current wars couldn't quite pull off. What did Tesla bring to the party that made that happen?
So the big thing in this is it has to do with the way you can work with alternating current. And this is based in, work that Faraday had done and then Maxwell had done, and that, these guys had learned to take that theory and apply it to real physical systems. Is in alternating current, the thing that you can do that's just so amazingly helpful is that you can do what's called transforming the voltage. And, in a sense, secondarily, you transform the current from low voltages to high voltages, or from high voltages to low voltages, using the transformer, which, most of the listeners here, if you look out on a power pole, or maybe there's a box somewhere in your neighborhood that's called the transformer, and then a little further out, probably separated away a little bit, is what you call a substation or a transforming substation, is this idea that we've built a power grid on this ability we can take and generate electrical power at very, very high voltages, which is just enormously dangerous. We can transmit those at high voltages, and the reason that's important is that by transmitting at high voltages, you have very low power losses, which means you have very efficient power transmission down your power lines. But then when you get into residential areas, what you can do is you can transform that power to a lower, much safer voltage. And so, typically what you're looking at is, if you have power lines coming in like here, where I live, we're not very far from one of the largest coal-fired power plants in the world at Plant Shearer over near Lake Juliette in Georgia. We get our power directly from there, and it's transmitted into my little town, via high-tension power lines that run at, several 100,000 volts. But when it comes into our substations, that's transformed down to about 2,400 volts. And then as that comes into the city power grid and it hits one of the transformers in our neighborhood, that transformer then transforms it again down to 240 volts, which, while, if I get hit with 240 or 120, if you sort of have that, which you can do in a way of sort of building a house, that's not going to be very pleasant. But probably, unless I've got some sort of, heart deficiency or some freak accident, that's probably not going to kill me. Whereas with DC power, that the type that Edison was working with, the issue you have is you had to transmit to keep the power losses from being too big. You had to transmit at 1,000 or 2,000 volts, and that would just kill somebody dead really fast. And so you really have these two things. One, you can take the power that you generate, say, at the Niagara Falls power station. And by the way, when you're running a turbine, the greatest thing about running a turbine is it wants to generate alternating current just naturally. But the way the turbine runs, you can set it up to run direct current, but it's easier actually to do it as alternating current. And then you can transform that up to very high voltages, transmit it with very low power loss across vast distances, and then you can transform it down for use by your end user, whether that's, the Kodak Corporation there in Rochester, New York, which, Kodak was one of the early users of the power that was generated at Niagara Falls, or a local residence. And it just, whatever your end user needs, you transform it down to that voltage and you're good to go. And that gives alternating current, and it's why we use it now. It gives alternating current just such a huge advantage over direct current, is that efficiency, and then later down the line, that safety.
So ironically, Edison was wrong. Well, or he was purposefully spinning the truth that his technology was actually more dangerous in practical terms than Tesla's.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. This is definitely a case where Edison was really good at media spin. He sort of understood. I mean, Edison's Menlo Park facility was an invention shop, and Edison was really as much as anything. And I mean, I don't mean to downplay the guy at all, because there were some things about what he did that were truly brilliant. He understood marketing and how to produce products for market that were just brilliant. But in a sense, he's a little bit of a huckster. Right. And so the guy didn't, and I don't think it's one of these things where it was, Edison didn't believe his technology was superior, but he really did believe DC was better, and he had invested a bunch of money and it worked just fine. And he was sort of stubborn about that, even when evidence, was beginning to pile up that no, alternating current was the better way to go. And, that's basically what ended up sort of running him out of the electrical power generation business, is that, at some point his business couldn't compete and he was struggling and in quite a bit of debt. And JP Morgan came in and just sort of bought out his company and combined it with some others and moved him off to the side.
We were talking a little bit before we started recording that Edison was really a practical man and that he was not as scientifically savvy as Tesla. Can you maybe get a little bit more into that Edison wasn't he was not as well trained in the theoretical aspects of electricity and these technologies as Tesla? Do you think that maybe played a little bit into how Edison ultimately dealt with people like Tesla?
Yeah, I think that's very, very correct. Edison's really a practical guy. He's inventing things. The Menlo Park shop was, as an invention factory, was a brute force invention factory. It was I think the story is he tries something like 1,000 different things for his filament for the light bulb, and it's not like he has some sort of material science team working out sort of the properties of good materials that have, high resistivity and yet can still withstand heats or whatever the case may be. He's just going to try 1,000 different things and do 1,000 different experiments. That quote that, he didn't fail 1,000 times. He just learned 1,000 different ways not to do something. That's really true for Edison. Edison was tremendously industrious. He understood how to produce things that would go to market. But no, he didn't seem to have what we would think of as formal theoretical training or formal theoretical education that would allow him to shortcut some of those processes and sort of, prune the tree of possibilities and say, all of these things over here, I have a pretty good sense aren't going to work. Whereas somebody like Tesla, with his mathematical training, with his sort of intellectual ability to see how systems would work, to visualize things like electric and magnetic fields, he had that ability to sort of sit down and intuit his way very quickly to things that, if they weren't the exact solution, were very, very close to it. And with just a very small amount of, iterative testing, would end up, arriving at the solution that he was looking for. And so, one of the things that's really interesting is that when Westinghouse buys his patents, he sort of says, look, I'll work with your engineering shop for about a year, and we'll get all of this worked out. And in that year, they pretty much work out how these systems are going to work, whether they're single phase generation systems or polyphase generation systems. They get a lot of that sorted out, especially, and this is the big one, that you're going to have to sort out, is how to create transformers that are robust, that don't overheat, that don't blow up, that don't delaminate, all of those kinds of things. Tesla's able to work with that engineering department, in a way, not just in that year, but then later on in a way that's very, very helpful.
Tesla comes up with a lot more inventions and innovations after that. One of the things that I really didn't even know much about until doing a little bit of research for this episode is that Tesla had a lot more to do with wireless communication technology than I ever realized. What did he add to what later Marconi would get a lot of the credit for?
Yeah, this is sort of the place where you talk about Tesla's sort of priority disputes. The priority disputes over the alternating current technology that happened, it's pretty clear that, there were a variety of things that went on that, Tesla's, role in that sort of was diminished for a period of time. But it's very, very clear that Tesla came up with all of those things first. But in the area of wireless technology, this is one of those things where it's not so clear. You have a lot of different people working in the area of what we call wireless transmission. And to sort of go back to the theory about that, this all goes back to James Clerk Maxwell's work in what we call Maxwell's equations and electromagnetic theory, and sort of the combination of electricity and magnetism as two sides of the same coin. And what Maxwell is able to show is that if you have a changing electric field, that generates a magnetic field. If you have a changing magnetic field, that generates an electric field. So if you change either of those in a very specific way, you get this sort of self-propagating kind of wave, and he works all of that out. And he's able to show, this is Maxwell, is able to show that, okay, these electromagnetic waves are actually what light is. And so this sort of kicks off after a period of time. This sort of kicks off a race to sort of understand these electromagnetic waves in much greater detail. And so the first guy that really does some work on this is a guy by the name of Helmholtz. And he has a student by the name of Hertz. And Hertz is a contemporary with both Tesla and Marconi. And Hertz is the first guy to sort of figure out how to transmit what we would now call radio waves. Okay, and that is electromagnetic waves in the frequency part of the frequency spectrum that we think of as radio. He's the first guy to do this, but he does it across a lab. 10 feet or something like that. He's able to detect them just a few feet away from his generation source. But once he does that, then there's sort of this idea that, okay, can we extend that? Can we develop wireless transmission of information in a way that's similar in some senses to what's going on in telegraphs, right? And you can sort of understand the desire to be able to do this, right? If I want to send a telegraph, say from, New York City out to Kansas City or something like that, to find out what, the latest prices on beef are or whatever, because the New York stock market, or maybe it's up to the Chicago Board of Trade, and you've got to lay wire, and that's expensive. And then you've got to maintain the wire. And if the wire gets taken down and it cuts the connection, you got to have someone out there that fixes that. If you can transmit that wirelessly in some fashion, of course, there's obviously a real technological advantage to that. And so there's a lot of incentive for people to get into that. And Tesla and his ability to sort of really fundamentally understand at a very deep theoretical level what's going on in Maxwell's equations, that gives him an advantage in some ways over what Hertz is doing. And Hertz never really understands Maxwell's equations, at least as far as I've been able to read, in their full mathematical form, whereas Tesla does. And then Marconi as well, working in much more of a technological sense of trying to just, he sort of has the thing of, he's got a very singular focus on, I'm going to extend my ability to transmit these radio waves. But yeah, that becomes a big thing for Tesla. And so almost all of his research, once he sells the patents to Westinghouse and works with Westinghouse for a while, all of the money that he makes for that goes into a laboratory to begin to figure out how to do wireless transmission of power, of information, of all kinds of things. And that's really going to become the basis of the rest of his work, both the productive work that he does and then later on the less productive work that he does.
Was his objective to basically get rid of the wires and high power energy transmission?
Yeah, the thing that's really interesting and what I've sort of read about Tesla is Tesla's really a fascinating guy in where his philosophy on this sort of works. In his mind, I think the idea is that the inventor and the inventions that inventor comes up with is to, in a sense, remove from the laborer the burden of work. In a sense, he's very different than Marx in this, in that in his idea, the whole point of creating these technologies is creating tools historically from the beginning of time is to reduce the amount of backbreaking labor somebody has to do. And so, in a sense, it's to advance humanity in that way. And so, whether it's his electric motors, which he understands very early on, if he can create these electric motors, the electric motors can do things, a great example I always think of, when I think about Tesla is the washing machine, which at its heart is an electric motor. Right, you're going to use an electric motor to run an agitator and a tub to wash your clothes, and that's very, very labor saving compared to what you would have to do in the old days, where you had to put your clothes on a washboard or something like that to do the agitation yourself. There was a lot of manual labor that was very hard on the human body. When you have an electric washing machine, all of a sudden that labor just disappears. The electrical motor takes care of all of that all of a sudden. That was his whole goal, was to do things like that. And so in developing wireless technology, his idea was this sense of, could he send power in a way that didn't require wires, that you didn't have to have human beings up on wires, risking electrocution, climbing and descending poles, all of those kinds of things. Could you send that power in some fashion in a way that didn't require people to put their lives at risk or to do heavy labor? I think the wireless information transmission was sort of an add-on or a piggyback onto that. That was, I think, for him, it was easy. He thought it would be easier to do that, but that, in a sense, that wasn't going to save as much backbreaking labor, other than, you don't have to send people, to fix telegraph lines and that sort of thing. But that was really, I think, what drove him in a lot of his work of inventing, was the sense of, how does he make human life easier?
Is it technologically possible to remove wires from the electricity transmission?
Yeah, absolutely, it is. There's this type of a radio that I think, we don't sort of think about so much today because, power is cheap and easy. But there was a way of doing radios early on, and I forget the specifics of it, but you could build a kind of a radio where you had a fairly long, what we would think of as an antenna wire. And the antenna wire was long not because it needed to pick up a signal, but because on those radio waves, there's a certain amount of energy carried by those waves. And if you collect enough of that energy itself will run the radio and power the speaker. And so, yeah, absolutely, you can send energy via electromagnetic radiation. I mean, that's, in a sense, if you go outside during the day and you stand there and the sun hits your skin while your skin feels warm, is because the electromagnetic radiation from the sun is carrying energy that your skin absorbs. But the question is that how much can you send safely, and specifically, what are the technologies to send it safely? And that was really, if we get back to sort of talking about some of the stuff in the movie The Prestige, that's Tesla's work out in Colorado Springs. That's what he wants to do, is develop a laboratory away from all of the interference of New York City and the urban environment there, that will allow him a clean working environment to test these technologies that will allow him to send power and information across a distance. Tesla
had a number of inventions that seemed just completely science fiction when he proposed them back almost 120 years ago, 100 years ago. What are some of the inventions that he had ideas for that have now come to almost complete fruition?
I think the biggest one, and I can remember when I sort of realized this, just how stunning it was to me, because I didn't know about it at all. But the biggest one that all of the listeners to this podcast will know is the fluorescent light bulb. Right? The idea that there was a way of creating a light source that could easily have application that was very efficient, that was very cheap. One of the things that, I think I read somewhere in my research for this, that if you look at gas lamps, they're about 1% or a little less than 1% efficient, which means the energy you put into the gas lamp, you get 1% of that energy shows up as visible light. If you look at the incandescent bulbs of the time, and present incandescent bulbs are a little better, but not a lot. But at the incandescent bulbs at the time of Tesla, those were about 5% efficient. Nowadays, I think they're about 14% efficient. Whereas if you get into a fluorescent light bulb, you start getting efficiencies. Back then, I think it was around 60%. Nowadays, it's about 75% efficient, that the energy you put into the light bulb, 75% of that comes out as visible light that helps illuminate your space, which is, of course, why everyone wants to go to compact fluorescent light bulbs today. That technology completely goes back to Tesla. And the way that would work and how that would happen that completely goes back to Tesla. And I think that's probably, of all of the things initially, that I think for me anyway, was a huge revelation that, wait a minute, the fluorescent light bulbs that I have in my classroom, that I have in my kitchen, that I'm screwing into my light fixtures to replace those incandescent bulbs, all go back to this guy. The other thing, and this is something that he does not long before he goes out to Colorado Springs. So I want to say it's like, 1897, 1898, is he develops what we would think of as the first truly remote control technologies. In today's technology, anything that's a remote control. So if you have an RC car, if you have an RC drone, so you have a drone that you're controlling from a controller, say on an iPad or a hand unit that's transmitting information back and forth. Tesla demonstrated that very clearly in a remote control submarine that at the time, was just absolutely, probably the best word is horrifying to the people who actually witnessed his early demonstrations, because, at first they couldn't believe it. There were those who thought that he had a monkey. He had a little submarine unit that he used to sort of show how he could control the submarine via remote control and use it to sink a battleship in this big sort of kind of a pool that he built, And, there were people who thought that his little submarine must have a monkey in it controlling things or whatever. A lot of people just couldn't believe that he was able to control this thing via wireless information transmission, what we call remote control now. But there were a lot of people at the time that all of the sudden sort of recognized very quickly that, oh my gosh, this has a fundamental possibility of changing warfare. And of course, what you have to realize, 1897, 1898, you're not long. You're not far out from some of these tremendously mechanized and devastating wars that are going to show up, whether it's the Russo-Japanese War or of course, World War I, or the Great War as it was called then. There was the sense that, oh my gosh, you could actually send these remote control things that didn't have to have human beings on them, and you could do enormous damage. And that was really troubling to a lot of people and caused, it was really interesting. He tried to sell that technology to the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Navy wanted nothing to do with it, I think in part, not just because they looked at it and said, well, we don't know how this would actually get implemented at a long scale or a large scale model, but just there was this sort of a bias would be a good way to say it, that, in warfare, human beings fought other human beings, not, human beings fought remotely controlled machines.
The heart of the movie, The Prestige, is the main character, Angier, wants to go from the transmission of electricity to the transmission of matter. Was that anything that Tesla theorized on or even tried to put into practice?
I've not found anything, specifically like that. And, the thing that's kind of interesting, and in my reading, I haven't gotten a really good sense of Tesla's response to Einstein. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting in all of this, other than we know that Tesla rejected Einstein's later concept of what we would call warped or curved space-time. He didn't think that was how things worked. But so you get a sense that maybe he struggled. He kind of made his great advances, and then, like a lot of scientists and a lot of technologists and inventors, you sort of make your advances, you make your jump, and then after that, there's something that happens in your brain that sort of keeps you from accepting new advances or something like that. And that may have been what happens with Tesla after, by the time 1905 rolls around and Einstein publishes his first special theory of relativity papers. But you get the sense that with Tesla, it really is just energy, which he does not think of as matter, and information. There's no sense of being able to recreate another, a copy or another piece of something in another place, what you would think of as, teleportation or anything like that. There doesn't seem to be a lot of that in any of his writings.
So really, even at that point, the theoretical basis of that from the movie, if this is happening in around 1900, wouldn't have come along until Einstein's general theory of relativity in 1905.
Well, yeah, and actually it would have been a special theory. And that's the thing that's interesting about Einstein's work is in 1905, it's his miracle year. And he publishes a total of 5 papers. And the last 2 papers are what we call a special theory of relativity. And it's special because it talks about systems that are always moving at constant velocity. But that's where he comes up in the second of those 2 papers with his E = mc squared sort of a formula, which, of course, is, I think, the most famous formula in physics now. But there's that sense of the equivalence of matter and energy shows up there, but not even then in its complete form. That's not going to happen until you get to a 1907 paper by a guy named Hermann Minkowski, who's really going to show how all of that works in its full format. And it won't be until, I think, Einstein himself will struggle with that until about 1912, 1913. And then it'll be 1915, 1916 is when Einstein will publish the full general theory, which has got the whole warp space-time and all of that picks up. And like I say, what we know is that Tesla does write, I think, or it's either he writes it or he sort of gives an answer in an interview, which is something he did fairly frequently every year and once he got a little older. But there's this sense that he really did not accept that idea, certainly of warp space-time, but I've not read anything about what he thought about the mass-energy equivalence.
Much of the fictional element to Tesla is that he's had these really wild ideas. Are there any ideas that he had that were just completely off the wall and that never did come to fruition as actual inventions?
I think the probably the most common one that you'll hear about, and again, this starts to show up in sort of the mythological sort of things that happens once Tesla comes back from Colorado Springs after a couple of years there. And runs into financial trouble. And then he builds his laboratory out at the end of Long Island, and then that eventually will run into all kinds of trouble. After that sort of happens, again, there's this sense that at least for a period of time, he doesn't seem to make a lot of scientific progress. You don't know if he's chasing wild rabbits. In other words, he's got some ideas that are really outrunning the technology. I think the more accepted explanation for that is he doesn't live in what we would think of as a modern research environment. He, if somebody like Tesla, I think, existed now, especially once they had, developed something like, AC power generation or something like that, or the fluorescent light bulb, they would have been brought into a research center. They would have been given enormous amounts of funding, and their ideas and technological sort of thoughts would have happened with a lot of financial and a lot of just what we would call sort of infrastructure support, and they would have worked as part of a team. And that's one of the things you don't see Tesla doing as much of, especially after, 1895 or so. Tesla, other than hiring a couple of assistants, works very frequently on his own, and he doesn't have a lot of success doing it. He's not one of those guys that you sort of think of as this lone genius out there who changes the world. That most of that success happens when he's working with other people, whether it's the engineers at Westinghouse or any number of other people. And when he does start to work more on his own, when he does become more reclusive, those kinds of advances really seem to taper off. There is what we would call a bladeless turbine, a way of sort of having what you would call a turbine in a steam engine, or a turbine in some other a turbine that spins that would generate power, that actually he does a lot of work on, and it just never really gets fully realized. And it's a really interesting type of invention, and it's shown up in some smaller scale applications that you got to wonder if there wasn't, if he hadn't had I don't know, an AT&T or Bell Labs that, sort of support like you would see in the 1950s and the 1960s for computer technologies. If he had those kinds of resources, if those kinds of technologies wouldn't be a lot more prevalent now. The other one that you'll always hear about apocryphally is that he was developing a death ray. And that's, one of the things that's really clear is we don't really know what was going on there. He references it. When he dies, the FBI actually goes in and sort of cordons off his rooms in the hotel he's living in at the time, and brings in an expert who sort of finds a box labeled, I don't want to say labeled this, but kind of, you can think of it. There's this box and it says death ray on it, Yeah, it's kind of strange, and the guy gets in there and what he does is he finds some what we would think of as typical electrical components, and you're not sure what's going on in that. Some folks have speculated that there was a period of time where where Tesla was really on the edge of discovering what we now call X-rays. Right, Röntgen was the guy who ends up discovering X-rays. I think 1897 is the date for that. And Tesla at about the same time is doing similar research with what are called Crookes tubes. And they're a very similar thing to what we would think of as cathode ray tubes or even neon lights nowadays. But it's research that grows out of his work with fluorescent light bulbs. And Tesla seems to be very, very close. In fact, there's some evidence that early on when he actually tries to he's trying to demonstrate these for Mark Twain. And he seems to take a picture of the metal screws in some part of the camera or some part of the apparatus, but doesn't get a picture of Twain himself. And never follows up on it. And it's one of those things where you really see that sense where Röntgen and Tesla may have been very, very close in the same way, but Röntgen somehow sees the implications of what he's working on in some ways and then very doggedly pursues it. Whereas by this point, Tesla's got so many irons in the fire and there's so much going on in his life, and his focus is not there the way it had been earlier when he had been working on whether it was the AC power stuff or some of the stuff between, say, 1893 and 1897, where he's developing things like high-frequency Tesla coils and, like you said, the fluorescent light bulb technologies and a number of other things.
This is the first episode in this format where we're not talking about a specific movie. So what I'd like to ask you is, if you were to have a direct line to Hollywood, how would you like to see Tesla portrayed maybe in a future movie? Oh,
that's just such a fantastic question, because that's one of the things I ask about a lot of the guys on my podcast when I'm doing biographical episodes, and I say, gosh, why hasn't Hollywood done this? I think there would probably be, there are a couple of three things that maybe you could do. The first would just be, I'd love to see Hollywood portray Tesla's rise from sort of obscurity and a little bit of this backwater, Balkans area, through just hard work and intense focus and collaboration and apprenticeship to where he develops this technology. And then the interaction with Westinghouse. I've always wished I could see a movie where Westinghouse was portrayed in a historically accurate way, which is really hard to do for a variety of reasons, I think. But I think that would be really fascinating. Westinghouse himself, I think, is a fascinating figure because it's, of all of the robber baron figures of that, late Gilded Age time, Westinghouse seems to have been the one guy that actually had a soul, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's uncharitable. But, he seems to have been the one really good guy in all of those people. And Tesla was really fortunate to meet him, especially given later, his interactions with guys like John Jacob Astor and J.P. Morgan, who were very much more how should we say, cutthroat is probably a good way to put it, in their dealings with a guy who really, whether he understood it or not, there seems to have been the two sides trying to take advantage of each other a little bit, and the money guys always seem to come out ahead. I think probably the other thing that would be interesting to portray is maybe that period of time where Tesla is sort of losing his focus. And that's, I think, the best way I can think of it in my reading of the sources. It's just there's a point where Tesla gets too many irons in the fire. There's just too many things going on. He loses that sense of discipline to focus on and solve a specific single problem. It's like he sees this possibility and all of the 15 different ways that it can be utilized. And he can't say, okay, I'm going to pick one or two of those and focus all of my intellectual energy on that. He's disparate in that. And I think that would be an interesting thing to sort of have somebody take a look at, is this guy that sort of, I don't want to say unravels. That's not quite right. But the guy who just can't seem to find that focus, I think that would be a fascinating study in terms of, intellectual development. I mean, I certainly can see Hollywood doing a movie on him or doing a treatment of him that's a little like some of the treatments you've seen of Howard Hughes, where you have this really tremendously brilliant and gifted person who, for whatever reason, loses the ability to take those intellectual gifts and create truly altering technologies.
Well, Chad, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been a fascinating conversation. If the listeners want to find out more about you, where can they find out about your podcast, The Scientific Odyssey?
Well, the Odyssey's out on, all of your typical sites. So you can find me on Apple Podcasts. I think I'm out there on Stitcher. You can find me on Google Play. The website for the podcast is just The Scientific Odyssey, all one word, .typepad.com. We do have a Facebook page for The Scientific Odyssey, so they can join us there. I'm on Twitter at Chad Davies, so that's another place you can sort of find me. That won't all be podcast stuff, but you can certainly follow me out there. So there's a variety of places to follow up on what we do out there on The Scientific Odyssey.
Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Now, this is the second in a series of episodes about the lifetimes and portrayal of Nicola Tesla in film and literature. You will get 3 really interesting perspectives on the life of one of the most important inventors and people of the 20th century. I really want to thank Dr. Chad Davies of the Scientific Odyssey podcast for joining us today. Chad really does an amazing job of explaining science and the history of ideas in science. That makes it really comprehensible and enjoyable, too. I mean, that's really the hallmark of a great podcast, is that it's entertaining. And the Scientific Odyssey is really informative and entertaining. I really can't recommend Chad's show enough. You can learn more about the Scientific Odyssey and subscribe at his website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com, or follow the link in the show notes. If you have ideas for shows or would like to talk about movies we've discussed, there are many ways to get in contact. You can email me at steve@a2zhistorypage.com. We have a Facebook page by searching Beyond the Big Screen. We also have a new Facebook group, and you can learn more about that by searching for the A2Z History Page group. So with that, I will see you next time beyond the big screen.